Committee on House Files.
Conference Committee on House Files. This is the Kiffmeyer motion. Conference Committee report on House File 2738, a bill for proposed an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution, Article 4, Section 1. The report is addressed to the Honorable Kurt Zeller, Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Michelle L. Fishbach, President of the Senate. We, the undersigned conferees for House File 2738, report that we've agreed upon the items in dispute and recommend as follows. The report is signed by all 5 conferees on the part of the House and all 5 conferees on the part of the Senate. Kiffmeyer moves that the report of the Conference Committee on House File 2738 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by Conference Committee.
I call the member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer, who will explain the report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The Conference Committee report that you have before you is very similar to the House bill that was passed, and it is a Conference Committee report, so as is usual, we do incorporate Senate language as well. And you will see that in the Conference Committee report, in particular, Senator Newman in-person issue and also verifying the identity of all voters being included as far as the concept. So very pleased, members, to say that the House position is very strong and brought back from Conference Committee. And I'm asking for a green vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion of the Conference Committee report. The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Kiffmeyer yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer, I note, and this is an issue that we talked about, and I'm wondering why it wasn't corrected in conference. The constitutional question says, shall the Constitution be amended to require a valid ID and to provide a free ID? But the question doesn't have anything in here about provisional balloting or substantially equivalent verification eligibility standards. And I'm concerned that that question is not really reflective of the constitutional amendment you're proposing. So I wonder why you didn't try to align the question to the voters with the ballot question, because I'm concerned that that's a form of voter fraud.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Winkler and members. It's very important to remember that this is a photo ID constitutional amendment, and that key concept is the root concept that affects the other areas that are in this constitutional amendment. So I believe that this is what the voters are voting on, that it is a photo ID requirement, and also important for them to know that there is a free ID with that. And so, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we have fairly represented the concept of photo ID requirement in the language of the ballot question.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, would you yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer, I'm wondering why you have this Section 2B in the bill. This was there before, and I've had a chance to look at it since, and I wonder why we're saying in this bill what the title has to be when normally that's done by the Secretary of State. Why is the legislature dictating that the title is photo identification required for voting when your amendment contains much more than just that?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler and members. Because the legislature has the authority to state what the title will be, and so we have exercised that authority of the legislature to do so.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer, would you yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Winkler.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, I understand that your position is that the legislature has the authority to put that title on there, but is that part of the constitutional amendment, or is that a statutory change? What's the nature of that Section 2B? Because it's not a question to the voter, and it's not in the Constitution. It's just language. So is that statutory language, or how does that work?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker, I think it stands clearly as read that this is Section 2 is about submission to the voters. That includes both the ballot question and the title.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer, would you yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer, the 2B language, though, isn't. It's my understanding that the title is normally required under Section 204D.15 subdivision 1. So we already have in statute a requirement for creating a title. Why are we adding that language here and specifying the title? It seems to me that that's extra statutory changes that might not be needed for the question or for the amendment. So I wonder if you could explain what the nature of that language is. We're talking about a statute that would normally cover that, so why are we adding those words in there?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Winkler, members, because the legislature can do so, it is our legal authority to do so. It is directions to the Secretary of State in regards to placing the title on the ballot. And we, as the legislature, have the authority to do so, and I've exercised that authority.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, Representative Kiffmeyer, you know, I understand that your position is that the legislature has the authority to do that, but I wonder if we can amend statute just at the legislature, or if we need, if we're going to amend a statute like this, what the nature of that authority is. Is it statutory change that we're making? Is it session law? Is it constitutional language? Is it a ballot question? What is the nature of that, if you would yield to the question? I'm trying to understand. You say the legislature has the authority, but do we need anybody else? Do we need the governor, or do we need the Secretary of State to agree, or can we just do this unilaterally?
The member from Sherburne will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler, members, as was done in a 2008 legacy amendment, the precedent that is set there, that the legislature at that time directed the title, and so I am following that precedent and also using the authority of the legislature in regards to this area.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, Representative Kiffmeyer, you certainly are skilled at not answering questions. I will hand that to you. This language, we already have a procedure in place in statute to name the language, and you have a question submitted to the voters which talks about photo ID and a free ID, but doesn't talk about the rest of the things that are contained in your amendment, like provisional balloting and this substantially equivalent language, which we'll get to. And then you're saying what the title of it has to be on the ballot. It seems to me what you're doing is trying to sell your amendment to the voters, mislead them into believing that this is just about saying who you are on election day, when in fact your bill is a Trojan horse to do a lot of other things to disrupt and cause chaos in Minnesota's election system. And members, this bill coming back from conference is very different than the bill that we passed. The amendment is very different than the amendment that we passed. And this amendment is not just about a photo ID. This amendment is about far more than that. This amendment, including your title and the question, I believe, are a form of voter fraud, because you are misleading the voters into believing that they're just voting on photo ID when they're voting on so much more. And I think your Section 2B is proof of that. You're trying to limit this concept of photo ID, which you believe is popular, as a way to usher in a whole set of changes to Minnesota's election law, which I think will create chaos and confusion and will disrupt some very popular aspects of our voting, including absentee balloting and same-day registration. So I think you're committing voter fraud, and if I could offer a constitutional amendment to prevent legislators from defrauding the public, we could actually maybe get somewhere. Perhaps we could focus on jobs, Mr. Speaker, which is the #1 form of voter fraud your majority has engaged in, is a promise to focus on jobs. But Representative Kiffmeyer, I think that this comes back from conference very misleading and really does not befit your status as a former Secretary of State by interfering in how the Secretary of State puts a title on it. So, members, I would urge us to vote no on adoption of the conference report.
The member from Washington, Representative Dean.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Rule 1.50, I move that the House be allowed to continue session after midnight.
Representative Dean moves that the House be allowed to meet past midnight. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. No. The motion prevails. The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Winkler yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Winkler, who has the authority to submit a ballot question on a constitutional amendment to the people?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Wardlow, a determined majority can send whatever constitutional amendment they want to the people, whether it's denying people's rights to vote or denying people's right to marry people they love. If you are filled with enough animus to parts of our population, a majority in the legislature can send a constitutional amendment to the voters on any topic they'd like.
The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Will Representative Winkler continue to yield?
Representative Winkler will yield. The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding your comments on motivations for certain constitutional amendments, I think I heard the answer in there was that a majority of the houses of the legislature can submit constitutional amendments to the voters for approval. Is that correct?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Wardlow, so far as I can tell, if a majority wishes to send a constitutional amendment to the voters, they can do so. Although the wisdom of that, of course, is highly in question at times. But yes, the majority can do that.
The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if Representative Winkler would continue to yield to a series of questions.
Representative Winkler will yield. The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
So, Representative Winkler, the process does not involve the governor, and the process is not a statutory process. Is that correct?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Wardlow, I think that's a little bit unclear. Representative Kiffmeyer has drafted constitutional amendments with full enacting legislation combined with them in the past, and so the ballot question and the constitutional language are not subject to any kind of action by the governor, but certainly any enacting legislation or remnants of other kinds of statutory language or changes would be subject to gubernatorial veto. So it all depends on how the bill is drafted.
The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Representative Winkler. Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler. That's probably enough questioning, but I think we see here what the point that's coming out is that the legislature, two houses of the legislature, House and Senate, have the power, as Representative Winkler stated, to submit a constitutional amendment to the people for ratification. And as Representative Winkler knows, that's pursuant to Article 9, Section 1 of the state constitution. And the state constitution is very clear, and the case law on this is very clear, that not only is the constitutional amendment itself proposed by the majorities of each house of the legislature, but also the form and manner of the ballot question is determined in the discretion of the legislature. So that means that the language on the ballot question in the bill before us is not something that is statutory. It is extra statutory. It is part of and falls under Article 9, Section 1 of our Constitution. So we have the authority to do this, and courts will leave it to the discretion of the legislature what the form and manner should be. And of course the standard from the Breeza case is that the ballot question must not be so unreasonable as to be a palpable evasion of the substance of the constitutional amendment. And I think that it's pretty clear that this ballot question is not a palpable evasion. It is not so unreasonable. It's very reasonable, as is the constitutional amendment itself, which is designed to safeguard election integrity and make sure people have confidence in the outcome of election and confidence in the outcome of our elections in Minnesota.
Discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, here we are 2 weeks later, after this originally went off the House floor, and it's actually a worse bill and a more harmful bill than when it came here. Members, if this bill were about photo ID only, that would be one thing, but this bill goes way beyond photo ID. It is a radical rewrite of Minnesota election law in at least a couple ways. In the conference report, there's a new word that wasn't here on the House floor, and the word must have meaning, otherwise it wouldn't be in there. And the word is identity. That word wasn't in here, members. If you look on line 2.6 of the conference report, it now says that all voters are subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification. Now, when we first voted on this, it was just eligibility. Now it's identity. So, Representative Kiffmeyer, will Representative Kiffmeyer yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, Words have meaning, and the Supreme Court, when it looks at this, inevitably is going to say it's in there for a reason. My question is twofold, and stop me and let me know if you don't understand the question, or I will assume you do. First, why did you put it in there? And second, what does it mean? It means something. It must mean something because you put it in there. What does the word identity do to this bill that changes its meaning from the time when we went there? And I'd appreciate it if the answer wouldn't be because we added the word identity.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Simon and members. I think it has something to do with photo identification required for voting. I think it is clear that we have the word identification in the actual constitutional amendment and in the ballot question and in its title. So I think identity is very fitting because this is a photo identification question.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I assume that's the sum and total of your answer. Members, there are at least a couple of reasons why this bill is going to pick apart and really diminish Minnesota's election system. First of all, this bill, as constituted, really threatens to blow up and change forever same-day registration as we know it. And all you have to do is think about it, members. If everyone is subject to the same or substantially same identity and verification requirements of eligibility, if that's true, then how can it be otherwise? Because the system for verifying someone's eligibility and someone's identity is just inherently different when you register before than it is on the day of. And Representative Kiffmeyer, more than anyone in this chamber, probably knows that because she served as our Secretary of State for 8 years. So when you register the day before, or the week before, or the month before, or the year before, there are certain standards and processes and procedures that the Secretary of State's office employs that cannot and will never be employed the day of an election. For example, as you know, Representative Kiffmeyer, if you register the day or the week or the month or the year before, a person's name is run through a bunch of databases, the Social Security database, a death index, various indices provided by the Department of Corrections or by the Department of Public Safety to determine felon status. There are a whole host of things that are done and verified, for example, sending out the non-forwardable postcard to voters through the mail to make sure that they are who they say they are. That's all done to a person who registers the day, the week, the month, the year before. That cannot be done. It cannot. Metaphysically cannot be done the day of the election. So I would normally ask you at this point to yield to a question. Instead, I'll ask you to yield to reality, which is that this can't be done the same way for people who register before as for the people who register on the same day. The question has been asked to you many times in many different ways, and you either answer by repeating the question back to us in some form or simply giving up and refusing to answer, because your answers so far in every committee is no answer. So rather than waste everyone's time, I'm not going to ask you why it is you think that it is substantially equivalent, because you won't answer the question. I don't believe you will. But the second way, members, that this is going to radically alter and change our election system is now with this word identity in place, there's now a realistic chance that this constitutional amendment threatens to severely impact absentee voting by mail. You know, Representative Sanders has a bill that we're waiting to act on right now, which sets forth, as you'll see presumably tomorrow when we take it up, if we take it up, that sets forth what you need to do when you're sending in an absentee ballot by mail. You need to write a bunch of stuff down. And in particular, if you have an ID, you have to write down either the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, you have to write down your passport number, you have to write down your driver's license number. Any of those things you can write down if you have those. But there's no way to verify in any mail absentee ballot situation whether the person for whom the ballot was intended is the one actually voting. They can give it to their brother or sister or spouse or child. There's no way for us to determine that. There's no way for us to determine the actual identity. And so it would be logical to conclude on that basis that this will call into serious question the ability of someone to vote absentee by mail. They might still be able to do it at City Hall or at some sort of government office, but whether or not they can actually vote by absentee by mail, that is a serious question. Again, I'm not going to ask you to explain because you're not going to explain, I predict. But those two ways in particular are ways that will radically alter our system of voting in Minnesota. So I hope people in Minnesota are listening and understand that this is not about photo ID. This is about much more than just photo ID. If it were just about photo ID, we'd have a much more narrow discussion. Instead, this is leaking into other areas of election law that Minnesotans care about and that they don't want to see go away. The other point that Representative Winkler touched on is, I think, a good one. It's about the chaos that this constitutional amendment is going to invite. He already touched on the question that's being placed to voters. And members, I ask yourself just to think to yourself about this question. The Supreme Court has said in Minnesota as recently as 2006, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically that the question that you put to voters can't be an advertisement. It can't be spin. It's got to fairly and substantively describe what voters are voting on. And I think a reasonable person could conclude that by not including terms such as, for example, government-issued photo identification rather than just saying photo ID, ask yourself the question, could a reasonable Minnesota voter, looking at that question, conclude that their private sector workplace ID is good for voting? Could they conclude that? I think the answer we would all privately agree is yes, they could conclude that, because there's no limitation in the language. There's nothing in there that says government-issued photo ID. It just says photo ID. So could a reasonable voter in Minnesota be misled by that question? I think the answer is pretty clearly yes, and I would bet my next paycheck that the Supreme Court will say so too when the inevitable challenge comes. The second issue is we're creating a brand new creature, basically, for Minnesota, which is the creature of the provisional ballot. We typically haven't done that in Minnesota. So now some people are going to vote and have their votes count for real, and others are going to vote, and because they didn't meet some standard or test, their vote's going to go in a different pile. This is the we might count it pile, but maybe we might not. And if it goes in that pile, your odds are, depending on where you live, better sometimes, sometimes not, that will actually ever be counted. And so that's, I think you'd agree, whether you're for this bill or against it, that's a pretty big deal. Creating provisional ballots and a whole new provisional ballot system, potentially subjecting up to 500,000 people per election, those are the ones who register same day, to this provisional ballot process. I think you'd agree that's a pretty big deal. Should that be a part of the question? Is that substantive enough, noteworthy enough, relevant enough to inform Minnesota voters what it is they're voting on? Again, ask yourself the question, would a reasonable Minnesota voter read that question and conclude by that question put to the voters that there's anything in this about provisional ballots? Could they conclude that? Could a reasonable voter conclude that there isn't anything about provisional ballots? I think the answer clearly is yes. And again, I bet my next paycheck that the Supreme Court will say so as well. And Representative Kiffmeyer, you were told this in committee after committee, and you either chose to ignore it or took note of it and somehow thought that you'd roll the dice on a Supreme Court challenge. But members, as happened in Missouri just within the last couple of weeks, there is the possibility, and I have no way of knowing what the court's going to do, but there is the possibility that the court could kick this off the ballot on the defectiveness of the question alone. I'm quite confident that the court will look at this question and say it's a deficient question, that it doesn't adequately and accurately describe what voters are actually voting on for the reasons I mentioned and maybe others that I haven't thought about. And when that happens, the court's going to have a decision to make. What's the remedy? Okay, if a plaintiff proves that the question is insufficient, what does the court do about it? Well, in Missouri, they've apparently temporarily decided that it's off the ballot, period. That would be probably the most extreme remedy. Another remedy would be that the court decides to just rewrite the question. I don't know what they're going to do, but I'm quite confident that this question does not capture the essence, certainly of key details. And Representative Kiffmeyer, you had the opportunity to fix this, and for whatever reason, you didn't. Maybe you'll tell us here tonight on the floor why that is. Maybe you won't. I don't know. That's up to you. But I think we have a pretty complete record now. And a court can decide on its own whether or not they think a reasonable Minnesotan will look at this question and get the sum and substance of what it is that they're voting on and how this is going to change. I say radically, you say not, Minnesota's election system. So I think that's one way it's going to devolve into chaos. And then there's one other thing that we can all identify with this in this room, and that's the legislative process. So let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this passes and that the voters bless this in November. Let's just assume that. And let's assume we come back here next January and we have the exact same partisan political lineup. Let's just assume that for argument's sake. What happens? Well, Representative Kiffmeyer, I was at your press conference this afternoon with Representative Downey and Representative Dean, and you were excitedly talking about how we would work in a bipartisan fashion, and then not less than a minute later, not more than a minute later, you talked about how you're already drafting a bill. On the one hand, you're saying we're going to work bipartisanly, and then you're saying, leave it to me, I've drafted the bill already. Well, maybe you have, and maybe it bears some relation to what you did last year, which was a 44-page bill of enabling language. But the question, Representative Kiffmeyer, and I won't ask you to yield just yet, the question is, what happens if we don't decide anything? What happens if there's a complete stalemate, which, given what you've already written, what I expect that you're up to right now, if it bears any relation to last year's bill, is what will happen? Because I suspect what will happen, and I hope you prove me wrong, is that you won't consult any Democrats. You won't consult me or Representative Winkler or Representative Nelson or any Democrat. You'll write a bill, you'll throw it in, you'll push it, you'll send it to the governor, he'll veto it. You might do that another time or 2 or 3 or 5. And then what? What happens? What happens if we can't agree on any enabling language? Will we have an orphan provision in the Constitution that has no meaning, or will we be left with just the language that's in the Constitution, and then the courts will have to decide? So let's say there's no enabling language, none whatsoever, and a voter walks in with something like this. Oh, this is faded from the sun. This once had my picture on it. And a voter says, here I am, I'm ready to vote. I've got my government issued, check. Photographic, check. Identification, check. Here it is. This gets me in and out of the buildings on the Capitol campus. What happens? No enabling language, because you, Representative Kiffmeyer, and other, in my hypothetical, have come up with language that's unacceptable to Democrats and unacceptable to the government, and we have none at all. None. Zero. I'd ask you to think about that. I'm not going to ask you to yield because I'm not confident that I've got an answer that's worth everybody's time, but I don't know what we would do if there was no enabling language, and you're on course to doing that. Because when I hear you talking about bipartisanly working with everyone, when I've seen no evidence of you doing that even 1 minute of one day this session when it comes to this bill, I've seen no evidence. I'm not questioning your motives, I'm just stating my impressions. And you go to a press conference and you say, we'll work bipartisanly, and by the way, I'm drafting a bill right now. Well, I'm very eager to see it, Representative Kiffmeyer, very eager to see it. And I'm not expecting to feel very hopeful after I've seen it. But the point is, I think one question for all of us to ask ourselves is, what if there's no enabling language whatsoever? Nothing. Total stalemate. I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. I fear what's going to happen. So that's another way, as Representative Winkler said, that we're headed for sort of a chaotic situation. We've got other terms in here that are going to demand court scrutiny, either because they're unclear or because we've done no enabling language and they're going to have to decide it. One is the term government issued, and we had this discussion before. What does that mean? Does it mean a Saudi Arabian driver's license, an Iowa driver's license? Does it mean that the city of St. Louis Park could maybe cut out pieces of construction paper and snap people's pictures and call that a government-issued photo ID? I don't know the answer to that, and I fear that a court's going to have to decide. We have the issue of photographic. We're putting the word photograph in the Constitution, and members, you ought to know, this is one piece that was settled pretty definitively in the conference report. The Senate put on an amendment 63-3. It's the equivalent of an amendment that I offered on the floor that the Senate adopted 63-3, which would have broadened the language to accommodate future technologies. And I told you then, and I'll repeat now, that 2 weeks ago, Representative Mike Benson and I, coincidentally on the day that we last voted on this, were at a meeting of the Voter Integrity Task Force, and the Republican County Auditor of Cerro Gordo County, Iowa, which is Mason City, told us, don't put the word photograph in your Constitution. Don't write in permanent ink. Why? Because he said they don't use that, and no one else will soon either. He speculated that even the FBI is moving away from photographs as a definitive identifier, that it's all biometrics and barcodes and other things. And now here we are putting the word photograph in the Constitution. It's as if 20 years ago we put cassette tape in the Constitution, and 40 years ago we put typewriter in the Constitution. But that's what we're doing today, and Representative Kiffmeyer, you had the opportunity to change it, and you're the one who apparently believes that we need to have the word photograph in the Constitution. So that's another invitation, I believe, for chaos and confusion. And then there's the whole issue of what discretion we have. Representative Kiffmeyer, you've claimed that we have all the discretion in the world to come in and define constitutional terms, to come back in January of 2013, no matter who's in charge, and define certain terms. I disagree with you, but I think that there are serious questions, and I won't repeat them here today. They've been repeated often enough about what kind of discretion, if any, we have to change this. I believe it's much, much smaller than you believe it is. And so I would guess that what's going to happen is the Supreme Court's going to give us a tiny bit of discretion where certain language was used, and in the rest of the bill, none or very little, which means we're going to be left with what's in the Constitution, and that means judges are going to decide, which is ironic because we often hear from certain political segments that it's all about the problem with the judiciary is activist judges legislating for the bench. But this is an invitation for judges to legislate from the bench. So more chaos and more confusion. And I think it bears noting, members, that this is, I believe, the first time in Minnesota history in over 150 years that we will have passed along to the people a proposed constitutional amendment that is 100% on partisan grounds, where every yes vote is Republicans and only Republicans and no Democrats, and every no vote is Democrats and only Democrats and no Republicans. 100% partisan line of voting on what is the partisan subject matter. It would be bad on any subject matter, I would argue, but even worse when it's on elections, and that's what we're about to do here today. Didn't have to happen that way. As you heard me say and heard others say, we could have done this by statute. We could have taken the less drastic path. We could have taken a path that showed more self-restraint and self-discipline. Instead, here we have a total lack of impulse control and the beginning of what I predict will be a political arms race on constitutional amendments. Because again, as I said a couple of weeks ago, there are plenty of issues if Democrats ever get in charge of the House and Senate, which interest groups will now feel free and feel the license to push, which are popular, which massage the pleasure centers of the base, and which are popular, which you can get through because you can, because you have the votes. And so that's what's going on here, and we're setting a terrible precedent. But I suspect we know the result. Every Republican in this room is going to vote yes, and every Democrat in this room is going to vote no. And on the Senate side, whenever the process repeats itself, every Republican is going to vote yes, and every Democrat is going to vote no. And we will have placed, for the first time in our history, a purely 100% partisan constitutional amendment on the ballot and started a political arms race when it comes to constitutional amendments. That's going to be the legacy of this bill. And members, I just hope, not today, not tomorrow, but someday, that we all look back and realize the mistake that we're about to make.
Member from Nicollet, Representative Morrow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. I'll come back to that. Members, Senator Howe brought an amendment in the Senate to add 2 words, or equivalent, if you look at the bill, lines 1.29, 1.30. That amendment not only, Representative Simon, dealt with technology, it dealt with the classes of citizens who are being divided in this bill. Senator Howe's amendment, or equivalent, would have fixed the problem we debated for about 4 hours on the floor about valid government-issued photographic identification. Senator Howe's amendment passed 63-3. Senator Howe was kept out of the conference committee. Senator Howe said, "I believe my amendment helps keep photo ID constitutional." Representative Kiffmeyer responded, "We didn't have much conversation about that." Members, I'd like to tell you about some of our surrounding states when it comes to student identification. Representative Lanning, Representative Mazerow, knowing you have private college connections or private college students in your towns, you may want to pay particular attention. Alabama allows valid student ID. Florida allows valid student ID. Idaho allows valid student ID. Kansas allows valid student ID. Michigan allows valid student ID. Missouri allows valid student ID. Montana allows valid student ID. Pennsylvania allows valid student ID. North Dakota allows valid student ID. Rhode Island allows valid student ID. Washington allows valid student ID. Louisiana allows valid student ID. Let's look at our borders. Wisconsin allows valid student ID. North Dakota allows valid student ID. South Dakota allows valid student ID. We're surrounded by states that allow valid student ID, and yet your bill, Representative Kiffmeyer, will not. Because, Representative Kiffmeyer, your bill says valid government issued. I proposed approved. Senator Howe proposed or equivalent. We were trying to help keep your bill constitutional for the 60,000 plus private college students in the state of Minnesota. We haven't even talked about the 27,000 plus for-profit students in Minnesota. And it remains an open question about the 70,000 students at the land-grant institution, the University of Minnesota. So let's go back to the constitutional problem you've got, Representative Kiffmeyer. The phrase is similarly situated. Now, those who went through law school know the phrase similarly situated is part of the Equal Protection Clause jurisprudence in our country. There are over 1,000 Supreme Court opinions that use the phrase similarly situated. Representative Downey, you didn't go to law school, so let me just tell you, what's that mean? Like people should be treated alike. Like people should be treated alike. The Equal Protection Clause requires states to treat similarly situated people alike. There is no meaningful difference between the MSU Mankato student and the Bethany Lutheran student about 3 miles away from MSU. There is no constitutionally meaningful distinction, Representative Lanning, between the private college students in Fargo-Moorhead and the students at the state institutions. This bill is going to be found unconstitutional, and you could have fixed it. Let's go back to the quote. Our Constitution is colorblind. Now, Representative Wardlow, I know you're a historian. You probably recognize that phrase from Justice Harlan in his dissent in a really infamous case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that gave us the idea that separate schools could be equal, separate but equal. In the world of voting rights, tonight we've got separate but equal. No, it's actually separate and unequal. This bill separates private college students and public college students. And I would urge members to be very careful and think of Justice Harlan's words. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. You push a green button on this, what you're saying is it is okay for the state of Minnesota, it is constitutional, it is moral, and it is democratic to treat private college students differently than public college students. We've had not one piece of evidence justifying that distinction. I wish we had kept Senator Howe's amendment. I wish we had changed issue to approved. As Representative Simon says, we are allowing driver's licenses from around the world, but we are not allowing identification from the institutions that some of you are sending your children.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is Representative Wardlow available to yield to a question?
Representative Wardlow will yield. Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I wouldn't take the time to talk about this late at night unless I thought it was important. But looking at lines 2.17 through 2.19, Representative Wardlow, I think you were confused about the point that Representative Winkler was making. And what I would ask you is, Representative Wardlow, is Minnesota Statute 204D.15 a law?
The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hortman, yes, Statute 204D15 is in law. It is a statute, and of course, the reference to it in this bill is not in law. This is separate from our statutes, and the language here is a submission, a bill to submit a constitutional amendment to the voters for ratification, and it cites that statute as authority for creating the question. And of course, the discretion to create the question is left to the legislature pursuant to the Constitution as has been interpreted by the courts.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If he would yield, how does a bill become a law, Representative Wardlow?
Representative Wardlow will yield. The member from Dakota, Representative Wardlow.
It's a very complex process, I've learned.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Well, let me help you out, Representative Wardlow. A bill becomes a law when a majority of the House and the Senate pass it, and then the governor signs it, or if the governor fails to sign the bill, the veto is overridden in the House and the Senate. Minnesota Statute 204D.15 is a law. While we might be able to submit a constitutional question to the voters with simply a majority of the House and the Senate, if we wish to amend 204D.15, we need to pass a law, because that's currently a law. So, Representative Wardlow, the point that Representative Winkler was making that apparently you didn't understand is that Representative Kiffmeyer has included language in this bill stating what she believes the language should be atop of the question on the ballot. But I'd invite you to read Minnesota Statute 204D.15, because that law that's currently on the books that we cannot change by a simple majority vote of the House and Senate, but has to be signed by the governor, that law says that the Secretary of State shall provide an appropriate title for each question. So the Secretary of the State has a responsibility under state law that currently exists to provide an appropriate title. Appropriate meaning not misleading. And while you can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, Representative Wardlow, without any minority votes, with a simple bare majority, you cannot change state law. And as such, lines 2.17 to 2.19 can have no effect. And the Minnesota Secretary of State, under current law, shall adopt an appropriate title for any question that should appear on the ballot.
The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Pursuant to Rule Number 1.22, it's my intention to place Senate File 2493, which is the Erdahl Legacy Bill, House File 2580, which is the Loon Bill, House File 2729, the Loon Bill, House File Number 2164, McNamara, House File 2754, House, the Capital Investment Bill, to fund the capital renovation. And just so you don't think it's Groundhog's Day, Senate File Number 1543, Representative Mack, a new one. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to respond to a couple of the points that have been made by those opposing this amendment. The comment has been made a few times that this amendment is going to result in chaos in our election system, and I think you'd find the exact opposite experience in other states. Again, some personal experience of mine in Indiana. The photo ID law was passed in July of 2005, and they implemented it in their spring primary in May of 2006. And what was remarkable was the efficiency and effectiveness of the way it was implemented. And people might be interested in the Secretary of State's plan for implementing that, and a little bit of proactive effort in a positive direction can go a long way. So I think this generalized concept that somehow this is going to result in chaos is simply a scare tactic. Another point that's been brought up by Representative Morrow over and over again about all of the other states that allow student IDs to be used. Just to be clear, government-issued student IDs in Minnesota would also be allowed, and a number of other states do require a government-issued ID to be used. So again, the assertion that somehow the fact that we have a government-issued ID requirement in our law is going to either create chaos or cause some kind of legal challenge problems is not substantiated by experience in other states as well. And maybe most importantly, members, in the discussion to date, the attack has been largely on the ballot question and its adequacy. And if I could, Mr. Speaker, would Representative Kiffmeyer yield to a question or two?
She will. The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kiffmeyer, I know you know these statistics better than I, but what percentage of ballots in other states that end up being cast under a provisional system, what percentage of overall ballots actually end up getting cast provisionally?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Downey, members. In a variety of different states, it's a very, very low percentage. There is some variation. The most recent number was 271 in the state of Wisconsin, which also has same-day voter registration, similar population to Minnesota, but there's an intensive debate about, study about that, and showing that all the forecast that, oh, it's going to be all these huge numbers, it's all going to be this big issue, and ahead of that, but in all the states, and there's 43 states that do use provisional ballots. Minnesota is only one of 7 that do not, and in all of those other states, the numbers of provisional ballots are all very, very low, sometimes 0.3%. Other times maybe 1%, but in all cases, very, very low.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kiffmeyer, I think if you do some math on a couple hundred provisional ballots in Wisconsin, you're literally talking probably 1/100% in other states. I think in Indiana they have routinely maybe a couple thousand out of 4 million or so registered voters casting ballots. And so literally the percentage of folks that would cast a provisional ballot is a fraction of a percent. And so I think when 100% of the voters in Minnesota would be subject to the photo ID requirement, it's entirely appropriate to mention and have the central feature of the ballot question be the photo ID requirement. And when literally only 0.1% of Minnesotans might in the end have to cast a provisional ballot, members, I think it would be entirely confusing and misleading to include something about provisional ballots in the ballot question itself. And so I think this line of argumentation that the Democrats are offering in order to support their eventual litigation on this ballot question is really unfounded. It would be actually more misleading and false advertising to include in the question mention and some kind of a description of a provisional ballot when in fact literally 0.1% of Minnesotans might ever have to encounter that. And in fact the fundamental premise of the ballot question, the essence of the law being cast, is about the fact that every Minnesotan needs to be aware that they will have to cast or present the photo identification to vote. So members, I think Representative Kiffmeyer has crafted the ballot question just right. It's got the key central tenet in it, and this argument that somehow provisional ballots or other enabling pieces of legislation should be included in it is really just a little bit of a distraction here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield for a question?
She will yield, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, when this bill was before us last, I asked a couple of questions about how mail-in balloting, which we've had in practice in this state for some time, would work, and the answer was kind of vague. I thought perhaps it would be clarified when the bill came back from conference, but I don't really find that to be the case. And Representative Kiffmeyer, as of course you're well aware as a former Secretary of State, the way mail-in balloting works currently is that approximately 30 days or no less than 30 days before Election Day, the county auditor in counties that have mail-in balloting, and the counties I represent, it's approximately 15% of the precincts, mails a ballot to all registered voters in those precincts that are eligible, and they simply cast their votes as they choose, put them in the proper envelope with proper identification, and mail them back to the county auditor. Could you describe for me how you envision this process working if the amendment that's proposed is passed by the people and becomes part of our state constitution?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Hilty and members. Glad to do that. Matter of fact, one of the handouts that I have distributed on the House floor is a sample of one kind of an absentee ballot. And mail ballots are very similar to an absentee ballot in that they come through the mail. And we give them different names, but they are still through the mail and not in-person kind of voter. And if you'll notice on the current absentee ballot envelope, there's a place for the voter's name, voter's address. There's even a place for an ID number. And by the way, substantially equivalent is not identical, just like we are equal but not identical. There are many features about us as human beings in regards to our physical structure. And yet there's differences. Every single one of us on the House floor here looks a bit different. And so we have that equality, but we are not identical. And in this regard also, whether you are mail ballot, submitting your ballot through the mail, or whether you are doing an absentee ballot, you are not in person, substantially equivalent can be including that ID number and being able to process that. And the one thing about absentee ballots or mail ballots, there is more time given. So the process includes the opportunity to do the work that is necessary and is currently being done as well. Not only that, I'll call your attention to the bottom of the absentee ballot envelope. There's a witness that completes the section. And in current law, sorry, I got to get my glasses out. This is a very, very small print here. But you'll realize that there already is a witness signature that would be similar to the fact that in a polling place, you would have an election judge see you sign the roster. Matter of fact, very similar. So you have a witness name, the address, an official title, or a notary. The voter showed me the blank ballots before voting. The voter marked the ballots in private or physically unable to mark the ballots. The ballots were marked as directed by the voter. The voter enclosed and sealed the ballots in the ballot envelope. And I am or have been registered to vote in Minnesota or am a notary. And this is for the witness signature. So this is substantially equivalent to the polling place. You have a witness, you have an ID number. You have a witness who is there in that regard, and this is current Minnesota law. So what's the difference? We have a checkbox that says, I do not have a Minnesota-issued driver's license. And so when the constitutional amendment passes and government-issued is defined by the legislature, and you know, you either want to be included in the discussion of government-issued so that the next legislature is included in regards to that discussion, which you will be. And if you are, then that is something that will be decided in a final sort of way by the next legislature. And so you would take away that box, I do not have. You would expand the kind of government-issued IDs up above. All this can be included in the same, and you get your substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification as part of the process that we are doing today. And with some constitutional language that we would have, we'd make some changes, broaden the IDs probably on government issued than what is there today, and we are able to proceed. So absentee balloting and casting a ballot via the mail, taking current Minnesota law, will work very well. Thank you.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If Representative Kiffmeyer would continue to yield.
She will yield. Representative Hilty.
Representative Kiffmeyer, I did anticipate your response saying that the box that one could currently check that says I do not have a Minnesota-issued driver's license, ID card, or Social Security number would disappear. Are you saying also that the line that says that identifies as an acceptable ID number would the last 4 digits of one's Social Security number would also be under unacceptable under your proposal?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Representative Hilty, and members. As I said, Representative Hilty, that this would be modified to fit in with the constitutional amendment once it is passed, and the legislature would have the opportunity to, in a bipartisan way, weigh in, including the governor, in regards to defining government issued. I am showing you here what is current, and so it doesn't mean that all of the information here, as I've said before, would be exactly the same, because the constitutional amendment could broaden the government issued IDs, but it's the checkbox that would start with I do not have, but whether it's a Social Security number, Minnesota driver's license, the last 4, or something like that, I believe that a government-issued photo ID would say you would need to have a government-issued photo ID, and that number would be included there.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Kiffmeyer, then, if someone who currently is able to vote by mail because they are currently registered did not have a government-issued photo ID, does that mean they would have to travel, probably in my district, to the county seat in order to obtain one? And could you just remind me what documents would be required in order for one to be eligible to receive a free government-issued photo ID?
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'll call your attention to line 2.1, where it says, to an eligible voter who does not have a form of identification meeting the requirements of this section. And so, Representative Hilty, they would go through the customary process, and again, this is Minnesota state ID, a government-issued ID, and those forms of government-issued ID by the legislature, which could be commonly known as a driver's license or a state ID, maybe a passport, tribal ID, or a military ID. Those are commonly understood as government-issued IDs in most any state that I have taken a look at. And so, by the way, one thing I know in rural Minnesota, you don't go to town just for one thing. Generally, in Minnesota, people live out in the country to save gas and other things. They will combine the grocery store, the post office, anything else they need to do on the way to work, on the way home from work, during their lunch break. They have opportunities like that, and as they're able to get into town and maybe combine it with some of those other trips, they will be able to, if they don't currently have a form of identification that meets the requirements of this section, they will be able to, and they want something, if they want a driver's license, that's different, Representative Hilty. But I think if they are wanting to have this, and it's the particular purpose to make sure they get the free ID as a part of the voting process, then they would just go to their, and by the way, in the statutory bill we had, I think we had about around 140 locations. In other words, it could be the county seat, but there were other designations that could be used as well. Some of the other states, they have mobile units. There's a whole variety of ways that we as a legislature can work together in a very bipartisan, friendly fashion and work with the governor's office to be able to make sure that every eligible voter, if they have need, are able to get the ID that's required.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kiffmeyer, if you would yield the other part of the question.
She will yield. Representative Hilty.
The other part of the question that I ask is, assuming that you did have to travel to the county seat or some other designated location in order to get a state-issued free ID, what documentation would be required in order to be eligible for a free state ID?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Hilty, I think the question you're asking, I'm just wanting to be sure I can answer you correctly here. Representative Hilty, what proof do they need to have in order to say they need at-no-charge ID? They simply have to ask. And if they don't have, the only thing is that current Minnesota law, if you want a driver's license, but this does not require you to be given a driver's license, a state ID. So if they don't have a driver's license in particular, then a state ID, and all they simply have to do is say, I don't have another form of government-issued ID, and I don't want to have this ID. It's really pretty straightforward and common sense to be able to do that.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Representative Kiffmeyer, if you would yield for, I hope, a final question.
She will yield. Representative Hilty.
Are you saying then that one would not be required to present such documentation as a birth certificate or a passport or naturalization papers in order to establish one's citizenship and eligibility to receive a government ID?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Hilty, when you are applying for that ID, as you are today, the Department of Public Safety has a process, and if you're going to be voting, the constitutional requirements are that you are 18 years of age, that you're a United States citizen, that you're a resident of this state, and so those three elements are usually part of the getting a Minnesota state photo ID. That is currently understood, and certainly if a person is requesting this ID and wanting to use it for voting purposes, that would be certainly something that I would think this legislature and current law would want to have included as it is in current statute.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Kiffmeyer, currently one does not need to establish one's eligibility other than to attest to that fact. You can register to vote without presenting any documentation to back up your attestation that you are of age and eligible to vote. Because, for instance, under current law, you can register to vote by mail. So I'm assuming that what you're sort of saying by not saying is that, yes, indeed, you would need to present a birth certificate or a passport or naturalization papers or some actual documentation to back up your assertion that you were a resident and eligible to vote. So I guess my actual question is, assuming that one of the documentation requirements would be to present a birth certificate, and if one did not have in one's possession a birth certificate but needed to obtain one and discovered that the cost of obtaining a birth certificate from wherever you happen to be born in the United States was somewhere between $15 and $60, would the state be willing to pay for that as well? Would that be part of the free ID proposal that you're bringing forward?
Representative Hilty, were you asking Representative Kiffmeyer to yield to that question? She will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Hilty and members. The courts have recognized that in the process of getting the ID, that there may be those folks who would have need of getting a birth certificate, as they often normally do in regards to getting that ID. And so I don't think that the courts, it should say that in the court readings that I have done, the courts have not considered that an undue burden. It will be up to a future legislature as to how far they go. Maybe they should pay the gas. Maybe there are other things. And at what point do you have other voters who are accomplishing the same thing, and there are people who live across the street from a polling place. There are people who live farther away from the polling place. There are mothers with young children in tow. There are dads who get up at 5 in the morning, go to work, drive back home to vote, drive back to work, and then drive back home. So the courts have said that in the process of life, there are those variations, and the courts have not seen fit to see that that is an undue burden on exercising your right to vote. But it will be up to any future legislature as to what they want to do. One of the things that I thought was important, and that is the person who does not have a birth certificate or some of these documents, and there's been a courthouse that might have had a fire or water damage or something, and there is a process in current Minnesota law by which it's a one-page form, you fill it out, and the commissioner has the authority to consider any documentation you can have, witnesses, other people, one-page form, and enable the commissioner to make a determination when you can't have some of those documents. That's a $10 filing fee, and I've already stated that I think that that's so tied that waiver thing as a part of that may be something that I would consider supporting in a future legislative session. So, Representative Hilty, I look forward to having that discussion with you and considering all those things as we enact what the voters decide and tell us that they want to have happen.
The member from Pine, Representative Hilty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, well, I think that what I heard is that in all likelihood, if you don't have a photo ID and you want to apply for the free one, it's very likely not to be free.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield?
She will yield. Representative Wagenius.
Okay. Representative Kiffmeyer, there are actually two parts to your photo ID on line 1.29 and 1.30. A person must have one, and then they must present it, obviously there, to an election judge who is going to say this is okay or not okay. So I'm looking at the parallel language for the absentee voters on lines 2.5 and 2.6. So I'm not quite, just from a practical point of view, to have substantially equivalent identity verification, what that says to me is you have to, if you're going to be an absentee voter, have someone, not only that you want a ballot and present and you want a ballot, but you have to have someone verify that you are you. In other words, maybe a notary public. So that's the way I am reading this language, that substantially equivalent identity verification for an absentee ballot means that the person who is asking for an absentee ballot would have to have their signature notified, because then the notary can look them in the eye and see that's the person. Am I reading that correctly?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
No, Mr. Speaker and Representative Wagenius, it's a witness signature. There is no requirement that it has to be a notary. That is one option. There are those who choose that option. Matter of fact, in particular, it's just a preference for some people. And so it's the option of the voter, and the witness signature there does not require that it be a notary.
The member from Hennepin, Representative McGuinness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, that's current law. I am talking about what happens when we change the Constitution and require substantially equivalent identity verification. That's different than anything we have in our Constitution. So when a court looks at this, they will say, what is different? What is additionally required by this constitutional language? So it would not be what's current law. So I'm trying to figure out, practically speaking, what somebody who wants to cast an absentee ballot would do. And so it could be a notary, as I think you're saying. Is it possible that a court would look at that and say perhaps you need to have a fingerprint on file? Is that the way you have this substantially equivalent identity verification, that you have a fingerprint on file and you put a fingerprint on your ballot? Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield?
She will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Wagenius. Representative Wagenius, I think it would be the intent of this legislature to be able to have that witness signature a witnessed signature applied, and that gives that substantially equivalent component of seeing the voter face to face and being able to sign that that is the case. So I think that plus the collection of the ID number, and also that voter would probably have that ID number in hand, that ID card possibly in hand, or that government-issued ID, whatever it may be, that would be able to be used. So I think it very much does qualify. I don't think it means you have to have a notary at all. I think it is given here as an option, and I think it should be continued as an option.
The member from Hennepin, Representative McGuinness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, I would hope that that would be the case. However, if that were the case, we would not need these words, these new words in the Constitution. When we put these new words in the Constitution, the court will say what new is required, what is different, because there are new words in the Constitution. So my question is, what is a court going to look at and say we've got to do to have substantially equivalent identity verification when we know that if you go to the polls, you have to have your ID, and then you have to present it to someone. So what is it? Why is the language here if you didn't want something different? Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield?
She will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Wagenius and members, the phrase is not identical. It is substantially equivalent. And as I've explained, substantially equivalent can be satisfied in regards to what we have in current law and making some modifications to that, which I have explained. You can keep the witness signatures. Notary is not a mandate. Witness signature. And by the way, when you're in the polling places and you have election judges who are there, and so I think there's a great similarity in regards to that, a substantially equivalent transfer that I think will be seen quite well by voters to accomplish that, as well as collecting the ID number. And so, Mr. Speaker and Representative Wagenius, I believe that I can give you the same answer, Representative Wagenius and Mr. Speaker, and I know you may not like it any better, but I think that it is the truth.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you. I'm glad you've pronounced the truth of what the court is going to say about this language. What about military folks? I don't think those are witnessed. Are we going to now change and ask military folks to have their signatures witnessed? Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield for that question?
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Wagenius. In federal law, there's a federal write-in. There's a special provision for our military and overseas. And some of those areas that are used for UOCAVA, that class of voters that qualify in that particular area, because they are overseas or military, again, often overseas in that situation, they are able to use that section of law. And I think that that will apply very well here as well. I would suspect that soldiers are in the field, and that for them to assist each other could also very well apply here.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll move on from substantially equivalent identity verification for the absentee ballot person to substantially equivalent identity, eligibility verification. Can you tell us, Representative Kiffmeyer, if you would yield, what it is an absentee, a judge is going to have to do to substantially, equivalently identify verification prior to the ballot being counted? Because that's what your language says. It doesn't come off the tongue very well, but that's what the language says.
She will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Wagenius, well, one of the things about an absentee ballot or even a mail-in ballot, no matter where they come from, there's a time factor here. We have about 45 days for military overseas voters, they little more time, and then we also have about a month or so for the domestic absentee voters to cast their ballot. And it all starts with an absentee ballot application. When that application comes in, there's information on that application very similar to what is on this exterior envelope that we've discussed here. And so that initiation with that absentee ballot application, it's quite a bit of time ahead of actually Election Day. And so that eligibility verification is able to be accomplished then, or if they have not yet registered to vote, when the absentee ballot comes in, they're able to do that as well. And so, Representative Wagenius, especially with absentee male voters, this is able to be accomplished in time for and on Election Day.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
You told me that it would happen, Representative Kiffmeyer, but you didn't tell me how the election judge was going to verify this substantially equivalent eligibility. It's not the question of who, it's the question of how they do it. How do they do it? Would Representative Kiffmeyer yield to answer the question of how an election judge does that?
She will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Wagenius, in the absentee or mail process that we have, it is usually done by a county or a city. They will have an absentee ballot board with people that have been trained to do this. They also will have access to systems that they're able to do because they are in those offices, and they're able to accomplish that quite readily. But remember that the identity and then you have the eligibility, when they have already submitted their absentee ballot application, that is able to be initiated then. When the absentee ballot comes back into that same office, they're able to complete that process. So it is what is done now currently. We just want to make sure that it is done as well for those who register to vote and vote on Election Day. We want to be able to ensure that those who, because currently right now, those who register to vote on Election Day, their ballots are first counted by current law. And then only after Election Day, if they find that someone is not eligible, they can't go back and pull that ballot out. And we had about 23,000 of that situation from the 2008 presidential election. So clearly we want to make sure, but when it comes to absentee voters, or when you're having voters do it by mail, very similar, that they're able to do that verification process and accomplish that very well.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Well, thank you, Representative Kiffmeyer. Just a final thing to answer Representative Hilty. I can tell you, Representative Hilty, that in order for a child of the military or foreign service officer to get a birth certificate, it comes from the State Department, and it currently costs $50. So it is not an insubstantial amount. In fact, it's a lot of money.
The member from St. Louis, Representative Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've been listening intently, and Representative Kiffmeyer, I have to applaud you, because I think you and I could go all night talking back and forth, but I don't think I'm going to do that. 2 weeks ago, members, I talked a little bit about my father, and one of the things that he instilled in me was a deep love of country and for this state. And so when I hear words like freedom and liberty, I take them very, very seriously. And then when I see, Representative Simon, you made mention of 500,000 same-day registrations, and it goes up to as high as 700,000. And 2 weeks ago, I asked if those people who registered the same day could vote, and we never really got that answer. And then I thought they were provisional voting. So we have 500,000 ballots sitting around doing nothing when we had a governor's race settled by 8,770 votes. And then I say to myself, where's the freedom in that? Where's the freedom of my right to exercise that vote? Where is my liberty in that? And I will tell you, you are taking it from me. This bill is a bad bill. And we are full of malarkey, for lack of other words. We wipe out same-day registration. We wipe out voting. We have this myth of a free ID, which isn't free at all. We have an absentee ballot that we can't get an answer about. And then we have military men and women putting their lives on the line, and their ballot is going to be in question. Where's the liberty in that? Where's the justice in that? Where's the freedom of that? That's what this country is founded on. And so we shouldn't throw those words around freely and then come with a bill. You want to talk about fraud? Read the last line. Outline what it shall say on the ballot. This is a fraud perpetrated against the people of Minnesota, because it doesn't address all these issues that have been brought up. And I know you don't like to hear it from our side, but this is the party that's standing up for people's freedom. And I'm just wondering, when is it that we're going to call Buckingham Palace and ask the Queen to take over?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Gauthier. Mr. Speaker, Representative Downey was responding to our statements about this amendment being a voter fraud amendment by citing some statistics, and so I thought I'd tell the truth a little bit about Representative Downey's further misinformation that he's providing. For one thing, he says that states who have implemented this have seen all these wonderful things happen. The children are dancing in the street and everyone's voting and the people are happy and everyone believes in the election system again. But what he fails to tell you, of course, is that no other state has ever done this before. No state has ever passed this constitutional language before. And certainly, only one other state has ever passed any constitutional language for photo ID, and that's Mississippi, or they're planning to. And so we don't really know what the effect This is based on the experience of other states because this is brand new. It's fundamentally different than passing it as a statute because statutes can be amended. Statutes are subject to other constitutional provisions and legislatures can fix them. When you pass a constitutional amendment, you do not have the discretion of the legislature to interpret it the way you'd like, generally speaking. You actually have to have the courts give the final say. So your statistics about other states being wonderful as a result of their photo ID really has no bearing whatsoever on Minnesota. You cite Wisconsin and its limited number of provisional ballots, but Wisconsin has never actually had an election with a photo ID requirement. So I'm sure that there are very few absentee ballots. Representative Kiffmeyer passed out this little story here from Tennessee about only 285 voters casting provisional ballots in the Republican primary election, folks. So I'm really glad, Representative Kiffmeyer, that only a few Republicans were disenfranchised by this photo ID amendment. That's the whole point. You believe that Republicans will have IDs and therefore few of them will cast provisional ballots. And for people who are going to turn out and vote in a Republican primary election, I'm going to guess they're going to be the most motivated, the most consistent, and the most determined voters. These statistics that you hash out talking about how wonderful this amendment are is just another form of voter fraud, although this time the fraud is on the members of the legislature. But Representative Kiffmeyer, I think people are tired of the back and forth questions about what means what in your amendment, so I thought I'd take somebody else and ask Representative Benson if he would yield to a couple of questions.
Representative Benson will yield. The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Benson, you've worked on these issues considerably and have had your own opinions about them, which is refreshing. And the question I have is, on line 2.3 and 2.4, it says that a provisional ballot can only be counted if the voter certifies the provisional ballot in the manner provided by law. And my question to you is, could we pass a law that says voters can certify a provisional ballot by signing an affidavit at the polling place saying that this is who they say they are? Would that be a manner prescribed by law that we could require?
The member from Olmsted, Representative Benson M.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It does say a voter unable to present a government-issued photographic identification must be permitted to submit a provisional ballot. A provisional ballot must be only counted if the voter certifies the provisional ballot in the manner provided by law. If I look at that, and I assume by looking at the rest of the law that it uses the words substantially equivalent throughout it, that at some point that person would have to prove their identity and where they live.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Benson, I guess it's just a simple yes or no question, if you would yield.
Representative Benson will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Benson, could we pass a law that says that you can sign an affidavit in the polling place to certify your provisional ballot under this language?
The member from Olmsted, Representative Benson M.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I answered it, Representative Winkler, in that that person be required, just like he is in other parts of the section of the bill, that they would have to prove their identity and where they live.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Benson, I don't know if the conference committee spent much time looking at the bill, but there isn't anything in here that says anything about showing where you live. It just says you have to show who you are. And I actually think that we could do that. I think it says that it gives, this is the one section of the bill that gives us discretion, and it says that we can decide in law how people certify a provisional ballot. I think you could actually have somebody just sign an affidavit at the polling place saying, I'm certifying my provisional ballot. And then I have a further question about this language on valid government-issued ID, if you would yield.
For Representative Benson again. Representative Benson will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Benson, could the city of Minneapolis issue free IDs to anybody who wanted to show up at their polling place without an address based on vouching?
The member from Olmsted, Representative Benson M.
I don't believe that there's anything in here that would lead us to getting to a result of allowing for vouching. In fact, in previous questions, one of the things that led us to making sure that we didn't include or equivalent, like the Howell Amendment, was that left it wide open for vouching. And members, that is the biggest reason why we're here today, is because of the potential fraud caused by a person in Minnesota being able to vouch for up to 15 people at the polling place.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, thank you, Representative Benson. So, and I'm going to assume that Representative Kiffmeyer agrees with you unless she says otherwise, because we're now creating this really interesting standard. According to you, you can't have a provisional ballot that's certified in law through a sworn affidavit. Yet we have military voters under, and you can look this up on the overseas voting website. You can go to the website and basically say that start the registration process, and it explains to you that you need to give them a number of an ID or of some kind, or you don't have to, and you can just say that everything that you said is true. You can certify your own ballot if you're a member of the military serving overseas, and Representative Kiffmeyer said that would be a valid, that would fit under the substantially equivalent language. You could also, according to Representative Kiffmeyer, have a witness sign on an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot to support your statement that you are who you say you are, and that, of course, would be a form of vouching. And you also, Representative Kiffmeyer said that you could go in to get a birth certificate using a system of vouching. So as far as I can tell, the intention of the authors of this bill is that you can be vouched for if you are casting an absentee ballot. You can self-vouch as a member of the military or if you're voting overseas under federal voting requirements. If you need to get an ID but don't have a birth certificate, you can be vouched for there. But the only time you can't have somebody vouch for you or to certify your own ballot is if you show up to a polling place on election day. And so it seems to me you're creating not only different standards of vouching and witnessing and self-certification depending on who you are and how you vote, but so you're creating different standards, but you're also not making the election system stronger. You're actually making it weaker, because now the only real protection that you're providing is people who actually show up at a polling place. They can't have vouching. They can't have self-certification. They have to have some sort of government issue ID. But everybody else, every other way that we vote, there's either vouching or some sort of self-certification involved under this constitutional language as you've described it and as Representative Kiffmeyer has described it. So this is yet another form of voter fraud. You're claiming that this is somehow increasing the integrity of the election system, but what you're really doing, because if you don't, it's in violation of the federal Constitution, what you're really doing is creating a system where the easy way around your so-called voter integrity provision is to just not show up at the polling place to vote, but to vote by absentee. That's the way around it. And there's nothing you can do to stop that in the Constitution, because that would be in violation of the federal Constitution. You're creating a mess by leaving this language all over the map and by having this vagueness and by refusing to answer direct questions for the most part. So you're spreading misinformation about the impact in other states. You've got this Trojan horse amendment that disrupts absentee voting and same-day registration. And you're creating wildly different standards of eligibility and verification, and you're sliding this all under the doormat or under the door of substantially equivalent, which is guaranteed to result in litigation and court challenge. So you're really accomplishing nothing that you claim to care about except to create chaos and confusion in Minnesota's election system and getting rid of some very popular ways that people choose to vote in this state. You're creating a big mess for yourselves, and we are not going to be here to help you get out of that. You're going to own that. You're going to own the chaos, and we do not have to reach across the aisle to help fix your bill when the time comes. We can just let the courts sort all that out. We can let chaos reign in Minnesota's election system, and then maybe you will realize that the voter fraud that you're committing is mostly on the people that you're claiming to protect. You're committing voter fraud on all your BPOUs and all your Republican delegates who claim that when you claim that this is somehow improving Minnesota's election system. That's the voter fraud. That's the voter fraud, is you lying to Republicans about what you're accomplishing with this amendment.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Linczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Kiffmeyer yield?
I'm sorry, Representative...
Representative Kiffmeyer yield.
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. Representative Linczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, did you have any Democrats on the conference committee?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Lenczewski, we did not have any Democrat members on the conference committee.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Lenczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Kiffmeyer yield again, please?
She will yield. Representative Lenczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer, you mentioned that you worked in a bipartisan friendly way. Can you describe to me how you worked bipartisanly on this bill?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Lenczewski, my working in a bipartisan friendly way was for the future enactment of what the voters would decide when this ballot question is put to them. That was the context at which I said that. And we have reached out, but you know, when you have just a real bias against something, or it's either too loose or it's too tight, and no matter what, it isn't just right. If you answer, it's not an answer. If you answer, is an answer you don't like. And so, as you know, when we have conference committees, those who vote for the bill, and in this case, when it left the floor, there were no Democrat votes. And as you know, when we did the statutory bill, we had a conference committee member from the House and the Senate that was a Democrat, because in the House we did have 2 Democrats voting for the photo ID statutory bill, but when it came to this constitutional amendment, there were no Democrats voting on that, so the conference committee did not include those who voted against it.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Lenczewski.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, with all due respect, I have to refute what's just been said. Members, there has been no attempt to work bipartisanly on this issue. And I will tell you why I know why. Because there are 2 legislators, 2 Democrats in the House and Senate, as Representative Kiffmeyer just told you, who voted for the statutory voter ID. And neither of them, and I am one of them, has ever been spoken to about this issue ever since that vote. A year has passed. Wouldn't you think that somebody who wanted a bipartisan effort here would have gone to the only 2 Democrats in the state who voted for the statutory change to ask us what we might do? And I've consulted with that other Democrat, and neither of us have been spoken to for a year. There has been zero effort, Mr. Speaker, none whatsoever, to work bipartisanly on this issue. I stood and made a speech a year ago that I wanted to work bipartisanly, that if there was a way to increase voter turnout, not suppress voter turnout, and to work with Governor Dayton, I stood ready. The silence has been deafening for a year. I've sat right here. I sit 15 feet from the author. No one could find my desk for a year. Members, this is not a bipartisan constitutional amendment, and everybody here knows it. But so why does that matter? Big deal. Who cares? We do things here that aren't bipartisan. Well, to the conference committee, Mr. Speaker, and to you, Representative Kiffmeyer, that is not how things are always done. Indeed, this body knows that when I chaired a finance committee, I had a number of omnibus tax bills that no Republican voted for. Yet I put a Republican on the conference committee with not a single Republican vote. And I went to the Speaker and I asked the Speaker, I know there was not a single Republican vote. Please put a Republican on the conference committee. And that Speaker did. So Representative Kiffmeyer, and to you directly, Speaker Zellers, you absolutely could have made this a bipartisan effort, and you didn't. So that's just the short term here and now, but the long-term problems, remember, are so much bigger on this issue. In the short time I've been here, I've seen a couple of constitutional amendments. And I will tell you, they were bipartisan. In fact, sitting here in this room, Mr. Speaker, are 2 Republicans who voted for one of them, Representative Abler and Representative Garofalo, voted for the constitutional amendment in the transportation funding bill. There were some folks who even lost their elections over that vote, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Garofalo and Representative Abler voted for the constitutional amendment to dedicate the MVEST funding, putting it on the ballot for the voters. That was a bipartisan constitutional amendment. People can like it or not like it. On the other side, Democrats voted against it. That went to the ballot bipartisanly, and the voters passed it. The legacy, or whatever we call it, the raise the sales tax for the hunting and fishing and the clean water and all that stuff, I was a strong opponent of that. It went to the ballot. it passed overwhelmingly. The voters loved it. I was a strong opponent on that. I don't believe we should be governing this way through constitutional amendment. But the reason I raise it, members, because I'm talking to you about working bipartisanly. I'm not the only Democrat who voted against that. Just a few. Representative Huntley, Representative Mary Murphy, Representative Michael Paymar, Representative Hilty, Norton, Rukavina, Eakin, Greiling, Hosh, Liebling. We voted no. So who cares about that? Well, because there was a bunch of Republicans who voted no too. Representative Anderson, Bruce. Representative Anderson, Sarah. Representative Biskins, Drazkowski, Dean, Garofalo, Holberg, Beard, Gottwald, Hackbarth. You stood with us bipartisanly and you voted no. But it passed. Well, how'd that happen? That happened bipartisanly too. So just a few people who voted for that amendment to put it on the ballot. Sure, there were lots of Democrats like Representative Mahoney and Lilly and Wagenius and Tilbury and Atkins, but guess who also voted to pass that? Representative Cornish and Representative Gunther, Representative Hamilton and Howes, McNamara, and the list goes on. Why am I reading these votes, members? These were bipartisan moves to put things on the ballot. You heard Representative Simon say that never before in the history of this state will there be a constitutional amendment on 100% partisan lines. And Mr. Speaker, you have a lot of power. And I've enjoyed serving with you. We had a lot of fun together on the tax committee, and we had a lot of good debates, and you did a lot of amendments that put me in a difficult spot. And Representative Dean, you're a very powerful person too, and you have the ability to stop this right now. I know one side really wants it and one side really doesn't, but this isn't just a bill. This is a constitutional amendment that we're going to break history now, and we're going to ask people, we're going to put something on the ballot with not a single vote crossing the line. It's never happened. And you know, I'm going to ask Representative Thiessen, if he becomes Speaker, to not do this. And I won't control that. If the Democrats take the House and Senate next election or the next, they may decide to do what you're all doing right now, but I sure hope they're not gonna. You've all shown a lot of good judgment on a lot of things. For example, Mr. Speaker, your caucus made the decision to get rid of the rule that I personally thought was terrible, that my caucus limited debate. It was wrong. I voted against my caucus when they did it. People in the minority have the right to debate. And my caucus thought that wasn't a good idea, and they put on time limits. And you all stood up and said, we're not going to do that to the minority. And I really admire you for that. And I respect you for that. And there are occasionally issues around here that rise above partisanship. And constitutional amendments, members, are one. Think long and hard. This has never happened before in state history. Never. Ever. So I hope the people in both parties, as time goes on, have the good judgment to say that was a fluke in 2012 and we'll never ever repeat it. But they might not. And then there might be pressure for all the years the House and Senate were Democrats to put constitutional amendments up all the time with one party doing it. Yes, they've happened a couple times. Representative Abler and I came here together. We were elected together, and Representative Howes and Representative Mahoney. We're a small class. There's just a few of us left. We've been here 14 years. And we've seen two, Mr. Speaker, and they were both bipartisan. So members, please, Mr. Speaker, Majority Leader Dean, you can still lay this on the table. You can stop. You can get a good night's sleep, and you can think about this. Because this will go to the ballot then if we vote on this here tonight. And we won't be able to take it back. And it's going to affect us for a long time. Members, please oppose adopting the conference committee report.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I've been disturbed by what I've been hearing here today. Mostly, members, I'm disturbed by a number of questions that have been posed by this side of the aisle that we don't have answers to, and that frankly we need answers to. And so one of the things that I keeps going through my head is just how not ready this step is, assuming that this is the step that we want to take. And that it seems to me that we're not proceeding in a responsible manner. Members, it's 11:34. at night. It's almost midnight. We started this discussion about an hour and a half ago after a recess for a few hours. And the other thought I have is that yet again we're taking up an issue that could, at least from my perspective, I believe, honestly, could potentially disempower many generations of Minnesotans, and we're having this discussion at 11:30 at night in the middle of the week, and that just doesn't seem right to me. You know, when we started this discussion, somewhere out there, a family in Minnesota probably just started to put their kids to bed and tuck them in and did what good parents do, where you leave those kids feeling going to bed with a good sense of, you know, the world is okay, you know, everything's secure, we're here, and so just go to bed. When you wake up in the morning, the world will be okay. And, you know, by now, 11:30, those two parents have probably already turned in themselves, and perhaps like their kids, they're probably thinking, you know, the world is probably secure, you know, it's okay. We've got men and women overseas, Americans, who are safeguarding our liberties and our freedoms. Maybe some of their relatives are those individuals. And perhaps they know that the Minnesota House is, you know, went back into came out of recess, and perhaps they've gone to bed with that sense that, and, you know, my fundamental freedoms are also being safeguarded by our representatives tonight over in the legislature. And so while they sleep tonight, I think that they're counting on us, in fact, to protect a fundamental right, the right to vote, which really honestly just means the right to be represented by the government of their choice, not by someone else's choice. And they're counting on their representatives to also continue the great American tradition, actually more than a tradition, the great American promise of expanding fundamental rights, of expanding that right to choose our government, not working to prevent that. And members, you know, this really is a significant American trait. You all know our common history here. You know, we started out, you know, with a very small handful of people being enfranchised with the right to vote. We moved then to go beyond just propertied men to be able to exercise that fundamental right. You know, those backwoodsmen that fought alongside Andy Jackson, that defended New Orleans successfully against the British, you know, they didn't have IDs, they probably didn't read, they probably didn't write. They were part of a massive popular movement in our nation that asserted the fundamental right that all Americans who are born here have, which is the right to choose their own government. We continued that constant struggle as a nation. We moved into the 19th century with slavery hanging over our heads, and after a horrible battle, we eliminated slavery and we expanded the right, the enfranchisement to men of color, to black men who had been slaves, and followed by several decades later, after many decades of struggle of enfranchising women with that same fundamental right. And so these Minnesotans who've gone to bed, I trust by now, are basically counting on us to continue that trajectory, that direction of enhancing, expanding the enfranchisement. This isn't insignificant. You know, even throughout that whole history, there were constant efforts, and frankly, members, constant efforts raised with some of the same arguments that we have heard across the nation around this issue, about it protecting the integrity of the vote, of making sure that there's no fraud. You know, those arguments were used in defense of poll taxes. Those arguments were used in defense of having literacy tests. You know, poll taxes were very effective at preventing poor Americans, especially poor black Americans, from exercising the vote. Literacy tests were very successful in preventing that same community, but also preventing Mexican Americans in the Southwest from exercising that vote. Mexican Americans whose ancestors, frankly, were on this continent way longer than anybody else except for our native people, who were hundreds of years of this soil that is now the United States. And when Representative Hilty got up and raised, I thought, a pretty important question about, so what happens in the next steps here? Because, you know, we are putting the cart before the horse here. It sounded to me, or at least my fear is, that what we're doing is in fact backdooring and inviting the same kind of practices that we had with those poll taxes and those literacy tests, based on whether this legislature is going to make sure that any document that's going to be needed to secure that so-called free ID is going to come without individuals having to find the resources to pay for those documents. Members, this family who went to sleep perhaps by now is counting on us as legislators to respond to Minnesota realities, to Minnesota issues related to election, not to Alec's national agenda. I mean, we all know that these bills are popping up all over the country, and frankly, they're popping up all over the country at a time when our country is going through massive demographic changes. Massive demographic changes. And the thought I have is that they're coming up because there's a real effort to prevent the emerging America from exercising the same kind of privilege of being enfranchised the way all Americans have been enfranchised up to now. Members, every minute in this nation there's 4 Americans that are born. Every minute, right now, 4 Americans are born. 2 of those Americans are Latinos. Think about that. Our nation is going through a phenomenal wave of demographic change. And I have to say, and I'm not going to apologize for being suspicious, I'm not going to apologize for being ultra careful, because I come from communities that know that there is no historical coincidence between what's happening in the demographics in our nation and the emergence of these kind of proposals all across this nation. This is not a coincidence. I have to believe that in being a solid advocate for my community that I represent, both ethnically, but also for all Americans that I represent in my district and in this state. And so my message to this Minnesota couple, who's probably, as I said, after putting the kids to sleep, have probably gone up to sleep, is wake up. Wake up. Wake up the kids. This is the beginning, potentially, of the ending of that great American trajectory that we've been on for over 200 years of expanding the enfranchisement, the fundamental right of choosing, of every American choosing their government, and not having their government decide how that government is going to perpetuate itself. And I would say to that Minnesota family, I hope that you're not poor. I hope that you're not a family of color, because if you are, you're going to pay the heaviest burden if we adopt this direction. But I would also say to that Minnesota family, even if you're not poor, wake up. When one party when one party can put something this fundamental before the people in the way that it does, when not a single member from my party participates in either the shaping or the voting for it, then it means that you're next. So members, there's been a number of wonderful technical points that have been raised here, and not being an attorney and not sitting on those committees, I didn't want to belabor those points. I think they've been wonderfully raised here, but I really wanted us to pause as we take this moment in history and we decide to take our nation in a whole different direction than the one that we've inherited from our ancestors, of broadening the enfranchisement, of bringing everyone into the tent, of making sure that the government we have is chosen by the people and not by the government itself, as it puts up all sorts of new bureaucratic requirements tied to this amendment in the years to come. Think about this point in time in history and embrace your heritage. Don't go in this new direction.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Downey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, tonight, during our recess, I had the opportunity, along with a number of members from the other side of the aisle, to go to the Historical Society. They had an opening reception for a marvelous new exhibit. Imagine, an original copy of the United States Constitution, an original copy of the amendments, 17 of them, offered to the states that became the Bill of Rights, and an 1849 law, the organic law that created the Minnesota Territory and the framework for our path to statehood. Sacred documents in our history and civil society. I spent a little time reading them and looking over them, which was a challenge. The language is difficult. They also had 2 copies of the original Minnesota Constitution, the Democratic copy and the Republican copy. Handwritten. The handwriting is difficult to read. Even the print that's set uses different letters, that funny F thing for S's and the like. But one thing jumped out at me when I looked at the organic law that established the Minnesota Territory. It set up our government, a governor, a legislature, an attorney for the state, and so on, and limited the voting to free white men over the age of 21. It jumped out at me because I knew what debate we were coming back to tonight. You know, members, you can't stand before those documents and not reflect on the history of our state and nation since they were written, and particularly on the expansion of voting rights over the decades and centuries, to African Americans, to Native Americans, to women. The dismantling of the Jim Crow laws set up to prevent those who were legally entitled to vote from being able to exercise that vote, that authority, that power, that ability to craft and develop a government that responded to all Americans. You think of the wars fought and the people who died to win and protect our freedoms, and the courageous movements that used those freedoms, that leveraged those freedoms, and the vote to protect and extend those rights. And you reflect on the fact that with each step in that historic drama, we became more the nation that our founders envisioned. One where the Constitution protects the rights of the citizens, where the rights of the minority are honored and respected, where those rights receive their greatest expression in our freedom of speech and press, in our right to redress grievances against our government, and on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of the even-numbered years, when people across the state and nation walk into the voting booth and cast their ballot for the candidate of their choice. But tonight, we turn those ideas upside down. We turn the Constitution again for a second year in a row from a document set up to protect the rights of the people of Minnesota to one intended to take away the rights of the people of Minnesota. In this case, those legally able to vote. We invite Minnesotans in November to go in the polling booth and take away the rights of their neighbors to exercise the franchise, and to do so only to follow a narrow partisan agenda without fact or evidence to underlie it. As other members have pointed out, this will be the first constitutional amendment offered in Minnesota history that has passed each committee in both houses on strictly partisan lines, so baseless in fact that not one member of the minority party could be persuaded, cajoled, or threatened into supporting it. It'll be the first constitutional amendment that passes off the floors of either houses by strict partisan votes, by supporters who cannot or will not answer the questions of what the language in the amendment means, how it will be implemented, and who will be disenfranchised by our action here tonight. Who will be barred from voting, who will be left out of what historically has been an expanding circle of citizenship and opportunity and rights. We're responding tonight not to issues in Minnesota and our elections, but to a national agenda of partisan groups pressing an extreme agenda that simply does not reflect the best of our nation or our state. Members, if the founding documents mean anything, if the history of this nation and the expansion of our rights mean anything, if the wars fought and the battles won mean anything, vote no. Let's not turn the Constitution into a document that takes people's rights away. Let's honor the work, the blood, and the sacrifice of those who came before us, and vote no, and affirm the franchise, affirm the right to vote, and affirm the democracy that we inherited and should pass along to those who come along behind us. Thank you.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I thought it was very interesting that you brought up the issue of some partisan subject here. And I went to look at the Crawford decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, because I remember reading that they had something to say about that. Matter of fact, in particular, I'll just read to you what they said. It's fair to infer that partisan consideration may have played a role. However, if that were the only case, it'd be one thing, but it wasn't. The U.S. Supreme Court recognized that if a non-discriminatory law is supported by valid neutral justifications, which this one does, those justifications should not be disregarded simply because you have a partisan interest. That might be one motivation, but not exclusive, and that is certainly the case with us today. It was interesting, too, that in the Indiana case, the statutory bill, it was also all Republicans voting for it and all the Democrats voting against it. The U.S. Supreme Court dismissed that as an issue. It said it was one motivation, and it's legitimate. However, that wasn't the only issue here, and so I think that's important. And so they argued that before the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court did not agree. So I think we have that to bear forth there. Matter of fact, I thought there were a lot of interesting things in regards to the U.S. Supreme Court and their statements. A good registration list will ensure that citizens are only registered in one place. But the election officials still need to make sure that the person arriving at a polling site is the same one that is named on the registration list. Went on to say that in the old days in small towns everyone would know each other, but times have changed. And so it is in the United States. And they go on to say that some form of identification is needed and recognized as valid. They recognize that fraud disenfranchises and that detecting fraud is a sufficient reason. And so I think we have many areas here that the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized and spoken on this issue that members, we can take confidence in that what we are doing today is something that was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court and photo ID was found constitutional, even though the Indiana law did have that partisan distinction, but the court recognized the legitimate interests in regards to voting, in the list, who you are, the eligibility, all those things are recognized as valid by the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was listening tonight, I had a couple of questions that came up, and I still don't have the answers for them. I've tried to ask some of my colleagues, but I guess I need to ask the author. So, Representative Kiffmeyer, would you yield?
She will yield, Representative Clark.
I was listening when you were speaking at one point, I don't know, maybe it was an hour ago or so. You mentioned that in regard to the eligibility verification, that there were something like 23,000 voters who did not have their eligibility verified and they could not be looked at later. Can you explain to me what you were talking about?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Clark. In regards to that, currently, again, we're talking about what is done currently, that is folks register to vote on Election Day, a postal verification card is sent out to them after Election Day. And so in 2008, from that Election Day alone, approximately 23,000 came back from that postcard as no such voter or no such address. And so that is the number referring to. But in the meantime, all of those ballots were counted, even though the question about their name, who they were, and where they lived was a question. And so that is the issue that I was addressing. I hope that answers your question. I'll be glad to do more if you like.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, it doesn't really. I'm trying to understand. Are you alleging that those were somehow illegal voters? I have not quite heard that before. Or was there could be another reason that the people moved, or there was some reason that it was not delivered or returned?
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm giving you a fact that the 23,000 postal verification cards came back as undeliverable. Either no such name or no such address. So that is it. And I think that the recognition of, that's exactly the question. What is the root there? And I think that causes that question to be asked. Now, you might conclude something different than I might conclude. But the question is that meantime, those ballots were counted. Those ballots were included in those election results. But the process of verifying are they that person and their residency and other things have 23,000 questions.
Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Will the author yield again to another question?
She will yield, Representative Clark.
I think I heard you say, maybe it wasn't today, it might have been before, that the residency was not something that needed to be proved on the day of election. But I'm trying to understand, does this eligibility verification now change from what you said? I think it was in our last debate that residency was not the point. The point was to know that this was the person that they claimed to be, not that they were at the residence of the address. Is that what you're adding here by these new words, eligibility verification? Are you adding residency, proof of residency back to the voter ID requirements of the day? Mr. Speaker, if the author would yield again.
Yep, she will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Well, I would just go back again, Representative Clark, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Clark, that the importance and the state's interest is that you are able to have substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification. And as you know, it seems as though we have a desire by some to say, give me all the details now, and then the desire by some who say, well, we want to have input into that when we do the enacting legislation. So I think in regards to this, that it is important to realize that when you bring in a utility bill, for example, or you have your driver's license that might have your current address on it, and largely people do, and but say you don't, and you bring in a utility bill that has your name on it, that's within 30 days before or after the election, that's current Minnesota law, that you're able to prove your residency by virtue of that. And so that being given to them at that time is able to accomplish that.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the author another question, if she'll yield, please.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark. Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
So, Representative Kiffmeyer, the group of people that I'm thinking about that I think you are disqualifying here would be those folks who are homeless at the time of election. And the reason I say that is, as Representative Benson said earlier, he's very interested. Part of your whole point here is to do away with vouching. The only way that many homeless people who are in homeless shelters and battered women's shelters or otherwise not having a permanent residence can come and vote, and the way we've been doing it in Minnesota is by having a voucher, a person who can come. It might be the person who runs the shelter, it might be another person who knows them, who lives there. And I'm just wondering, are you then effectively, if I'm understanding what you mean by this eligibility verification, are you disenfranchising any homeless people by this? Do we need to let people know that homeless people will not now be able to vote as a result of this amendment being proposed? Mr. Speaker, if the author would yield.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and Representative Clark. I would go back again to the concept which we passed in the statutory bill, which would enable the person who is using a homeless shelter. It's possible that we could use the county in which they live or the city in which they live. There are various ways that we can make sure that a homeless person would be able to have a valid residency address. And in that particular statutory bill, we used the, if they were in a homeless shelter, you might say in that particular case, which, or it could be a county address, that we give them an address so that there isn't that question for them, because they are entitled to that. We need to know that they are who they say they are, make sure they have that ID, and that we, through statutory legislation that would come up next year, should make sure that we give them that valid address. And it's not necessary to have vouching to do that. We can do that through statutory and do a much better job than we are right now to remove that question for them. I think we owe that to them. It will take something that I'm sure you and I can work together on, and making sure that which of those sorts of ways might prove the best for people who happen to be in a homeless situation. But, you know, we're all working to end homelessness, and that they would have at least a temporary shelter and have an ability to have that and to care for them. So I would certainly hope that we would be looking forward to having that, or using that through a homeless shelter or through a county, city, or some other venue like that.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Speaker, so I'm just trying to understand, Representative Kiffmeyer, you're talking about your hope that the next legislature will somehow come up with a form. Is that what you're saying? A form that would be available to people who are homeless that would be, uniform? Is that what you're suggesting?
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Clark, you know, it's interesting because right now many of those folks get government benefits. And they need to be able to have mail addressed to them. They need to have other things that they work on. And what I'm saying is that they meet all the other qualifications that are in the Constitution, and they're entitled to that vote. The question here is their residence address. And homeless people, you might say by their very nature, are transient or in situations like that, that there are temporary shelters. What I'm saying, Representative Clark, is that we are able to work with the social services entities and the local units of government right now that process their government benefits and make sure that there isn't that cloud or question, that we are able to have them have an official address that can be used for voting purposes and for contact and anything else that needs to happen.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I don't know the last time you were in a homeless shelter, Representative Kiffmeyer, but, you know, a lot of people there don't receive any benefits at all. They work 1 or 2 jobs, and they come back. Sometimes they have a place they can stay for 30 days if they're lucky, and often they don't have any place to stay. And I would remind members that more than a quarter, 27%, I think, of our homeless people are veterans. So if I understand you, this eligibility verification, I think it's another way for talking about proving your residency. That's all I can figure out from what you're saying, and that you're saying maybe the next legislature will figure out a way to somehow make eligibility verification by residence other than vouchers. And I just don't understand it. I don't know why you think that's a good idea either, Representative Benson. It seems to me like that's been something that's worked. It's enfranchised our homeless veterans, our homeless families. I'm really disturbed by this part of it, and I just don't see you solving that problem. It really seems like we're taking away the right to vote to a whole group of people. You know, many who, through no fault of their own, are homeless. We have so many people now who've gone through foreclosures, and more, including more and more people in the suburbs. So I'm just concerned about that part of it, and it seems to me I don't understand your answer to really clarify this issue of eligibility verification, except to say that there's going to have to be some agreement in the next legislature that provides a formal proof of someone's residency, and that seems like that's going to really take away the right to vote to many thousands of people. Mr. Speaker, I sure hope we vote against this amendment.
The member from Sibley, Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. You know, just personally as a citizen, I want everybody to vote who's legally able to vote, but I don't want anyone to vote who's not legally able to vote. The reason is that waters down the integrity of the system and casts doubt on some of the election results. You know, there's a lot of organizations that have done work on this, and one of them is Minnesota Majority, and they hired they employed a data enhancement service on the postal verification cards that were sent out in 2008. And a postal verification card is sent out to new voters that were registered to the addresses that they registered under. And in 2008, when this was completed, 100,000 registered voters here in Minnesota, the addresses were flagged vacant or undeliverable. Now, according to the study, about 50% of those addresses, or 50,000, were due to data entry or incorrect address. But that still leaves an additional 50,000 addresses. And they took volunteers and went and tried to verify some of these addresses. And here's what they found. They found addresses that led to warehouses, a swamp, a forest, a freeway, a park, and in some instances, the addresses did not exist, or there was an impossibility under the city street and housing number system to even locate the address. So that's what causes the average citizen out there, and I think we see that in the polls, why there's such a large majority of people, Republican, Independent, and Democrat, that want something done to address this type of doubt on the election process. Again, this was 2008, and we're talking close to 50,000 postal verification cards that were sent out to people who voted in that election. And that's one of the reasons I believe that we need to start taking steps like the voter ID to address that situation. I'm more than happy to make sure that in the enabling language we try to make sure that everybody gets a proper ID, whether homeless or whatever their situation might be. But I do think that in order to remove this cloud of doubt, that we do need to take some steps here, and I want to thank Representative Kiffmeyer for bringing this forward as an attempt to address this situation here in Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to try to be careful here because I'm about the rules that you're not to impute motives, but and so I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that this amendment is not that you don't intend it to be to have the effect of disenfranchising minorities or homeless or seniors or students or I mean everybody's talked about the number of potential voters or eligible voters that you may disenfranchise. What I want to ask, and I ask Representative Kiffmeyer if she'll yield to a question.
She will yield. Representative Allen.
I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you're saying that this amendment is simply about a matter of following our Constitution. So under the Constitution it states that 3 requirements. 1, must be 18 years of age or more, a citizen of the U.S. for 3 months, and have resided in the precinct for 30 days preceding an election. So under the amendment, it states that we're going to require substantially equivalent eligibility verification, and I'll ignore the identity requirement for now. But so when somebody goes to get this is my question, when somebody goes to get a free state issued ID, will the Secretary of State, or however you say that much of this is going to be sort of hashed out in statutory language after, to implement this amendment, but will you require the individuals to prove citizenship to obtain a free state issued ID?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Allen. One of the qualifications is to be a United States citizen for voting. That's been in our Minnesota State Constitution for a long time. So I think in this regard, if we take an oath of office, which we all have, is to uphold that Constitution, that I think with that would go that you need to be a United States citizen. So in some fashion, in getting that ID, and matter of fact, one of my local constituents recently took their youngster in as part of the driving process, and it was required to use a birth certificate or proof that they are a United States citizen, or this birth certificate. Part of that is the age as well, 18 years old or on election day, and part of getting these IDs are also part of that. So yes, if you are required, and our Constitution has been for a long time, to be a United States citizen, that would be included as a part of getting that ID.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Mr. Speaker, I have a follow-up question for Representative Kiffmeyer.
Representative Kiffmeyer will yield. Representative Allen.
So under current law, when somebody goes to obtain a driver's license at the what do you call it, the Department of Motor Vehicles, are they required currently to prove citizenship when they obtain a driver's license?
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Allen, I think the issue at stake here is when this constitutional amendment passes, and we currently have this language in here, then they would need to prove U.S. citizenship in whatever way they choose to do that. By the way, many times when you get a passport, that is included as part of getting a passport. So I think it is a very important part of that, and I would anticipate that in future legislation that is an important qualification, and proving U.S. citizenship would be part of that. What is current law today may be current law, but what we are looking here is prospectively, and some of these things that are in current law may be an option, but if we are making sure that in the voting process that U.S. citizens who are eligible to vote are U.S. citizens, that should be included then in future legislation.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kiffmeyer. Trying to figure out a way to say this without imputing motive, but let's start with so that I'm trying to figure out why we would go through all this trouble over it said that the evidence that the amendment will have to be based on, if there's judicial scrutiny, it will have to be based on solid evidence of voter fraud. And so you've had some handouts here. You've talked about I don't know, a little over 100 voter fraud cases, and it didn't make sense to me that you would go through that. We'll go through all this trouble to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot for that limited number of voter fraud cases. It just doesn't make sense. So one explanation that makes sense to me is that in this country, and I believe in the last census we had based on the last census, it's probably an estimate that we have over maybe about 30 million non-citizens in this country, and that really, and so that is a sizable group to be concerned about, that they may not be eligible to vote, and I think that is something that. If you look at even going back to the Bush-Gore election, and that was an issue then, and it is something that given the increased number of new immigrants we have who maybe haven't been here for 3 months, or and that just the sort of Republicans tend to impute motive to the Democrats that somehow when we're vouching for the 15 people in our neighborhood that maybe some of them aren't citizens, and so that makes sense to me. So.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Conference Committee reports on House File 2738 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 2738 as amended by conference.
Third reading. Any further discussion? The member from Hennepin, or the Minority Leader, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to call the House.
Representative Thiessen moves to recall the House. Seeing 10 hands, the clerk will take the roll.
Thank you.
The clerk will close the roll. The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, members, here we are after midnight voting on one of the most significant things that we can do in the legislature, which is to amend our state constitution. And first of all, I do have to say, I really don't understand, Representative Kiffmeyer, why you want to go down the path of destroying same-day registration in Minnesota. I don't understand, Representative Kiffmeyer, why you want to prohibit absentee voting by mail in this state, which is precisely what your constitutional amendment is going to do, no matter how much you want to deny it. I don't know why you want to disenfranchise soldiers serving our country overseas, because that, again, is precisely what you're doing. You added language that wasn't in either the House or the Senate bill when it left the floor to require identity verification, a substantially equivalent identity verification. And you can spin all the stuff you want, Representative Kiffmeyer, which you've done consistently throughout this process, and it doesn't take away from the fact that what you're doing is telling soldiers serving overseas that they need to come to Minnesota and show their ID before they can vote, because that's what this constitutional amendment requires. Folks, this isn't even about voter ID anymore. This is about undermining the way we do elections in Minnesota in very substantial ways, whether it is same-day registration, whether it's absentee voting, whether it's let soldiers vote by mail. And folks on the other side of the aisle, you don't have to follow Representative Kiffmeyer over this cliff. You can vote no. You have the right to actually vote, something you want to take away from other Minnesota citizens. But tonight you do have the right to vote on this bill, and you can vote no and do the right thing and actually preserve a fundamental, maybe the most fundamental right that we have in this country. But more than that, folks, in the Star Tribune earlier this week, the Speaker called for a focus on jobs in the remaining weeks of this session. And I appreciate his words because so very little, if anything, has been done to accomplish, on jobs this session at all. And it's no different tonight, because the reality is, and there's no denying this, that this bill, this constitutional amendment, is not going to create one single job. It's not going to reduce the crushing property tax increases that you imposed on the families of Minnesota with the bill that ended the shutdown that you brought on the state of Minnesota last summer. It's not going to do anything to help address any of the real challenges facing Minnesota families. The fact is, this isn't what Minnesotans care about. It's not the conversation that is happening at kitchen tables all across this state. Folks in Minnesota are looking to try to figure out how to pay their bills, how to make sure their kids have good schools, how to make ends meet despite higher property taxes, larger school loans. They're trying to figure out a way to get ahead. They are not, I guarantee you, they are not sitting around the kitchen table saying, my God, we have to figure out a way to make sure that people show an ID when they go to vote. Now, I bet not a single household in the whole state of Minnesota talked about that around the dinner table tonight. Minnesotans have much more important things to do and much more important things in their mind, and I wish that this House of Representatives had those things on our minds as well. We can be better than this, members. We can absolutely be better than this. We should be making jobs our top priority right now. We should have spent the last 2.5 hours, we probably should have spent the last 2.5 hours at home with our families, because it's late at night and you are again doing this under the cover of night. But we should be spending our time focusing on jobs and property taxes and figuring out a way to actually really pay back the school shift, the couple $2 billion of school shift that you imposed and took away from our schools in the budget that you passed to end the shutdown last summer. And if we're not going to focus on those issues, and this is a very relevant question as we come up on this Easter break, if we're not going to focus on those issues that will actually make a difference in the lives of Minnesotans, then I think we have an important question to ask ourselves, and that is, why are we still here? In the hustle and bustle of this place, it's really easy to lose our focus. It's an important question for us, though. If we're not going to do the stuff that the people of Minnesota actually care about and sent us to do, why are we still here? Is this bill, is this constitutional amendment, and please think about this before you put your finger on your voting buttons, what Minnesotans sent us to do. Did you knock on a single door last summer, or 2 summers ago and 2 falls ago? Did you knock on a single door and say to the person that you're talking to, the most important thing I want, maybe Representative Kiffmeyer did do this, but all the rest of you, the most important thing that I want to accomplish when I go down to the state capitol is to pass a constitutional amendment that is going to make sure that people take away our absentee voting, or take away absentee voting rights, pass a constitutional amendment that is going to get rid of same-day registration, pass a constitutional amendment that's going to require people to vote. Oh, I guess Representative Leidiger may have done that as well. Okay. So 2 of you did that. That was the most important thing that your constituents had on their mind. Well, I'm pleased for the 2 of you that that was the case. For the rest of you, that's not the case. I think we all know that the real answer to that question is absolutely not. That is not what you talk to your constituents about on their doorsteps and on the phone. That is not what you put in your literature as you campaigned across the state. If you answer that question truthfully, then that board should light up with red tonight, members, because Minnesotans understand that the most important things facing us right now are figuring out how we're going to fix the economy. It's figuring out how we're going to make sure that we pay back the school shift and actually start investing in our schools, something that we haven't done. It's going to make sure that we are addressing real residential property taxes and not the corporate tax giveaways that you seem to be pushing through the legislature this year. We are better than this, members. We're better than spending 2.5 hours in the middle of the week, in the middle of the night, again dealing with a constitutional amendment that's not going to help a single Minnesotan. We should do better than this. We could do better than this, and we can start that tonight by voting no.
The member from Sherburne, the author of the bill, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, this is a momentous day here in Minnesota that we listen to the people and we give the people the opportunity to vote on this constitutional amendment, as our own Minnesota Constitution gives the right to do so. And we are exactly following that. Matter of fact, in no court case, whether it's a U.S. Supreme Court or any other court case, not one single case of voter disenfranchisement, not one. And I'm sure you were all out there looking, and they said all the same fear-mongering before. Oh my goodness, woe is me, doom. What? Not one single case documented of voter disenfranchisement in all those court cases. Not one. What do we have in Minnesota? The highest number of voter fraud convictions in the nation. Interesting, isn't that? And the court has recognized that if you have no system that detects fraud, and you don't confirm the identity of voters, the electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if those safeguards don't exist. That is President Jimmy Carter Baker Commission, as quoted by the U.S. Supreme Court. Without doubt, we stand in a strong place in that photo ID has already been upheld by the United States Supreme Court. All these issues have gone on before, and we will deal with them one by one and go through this process. What's important to note is that this constitutional amendment adds integrity and preserves same-day voter registration. This constitutional amendment adds integrity and preserves absentee voting. This constitutional amendment adds integrity and preserves voting by mail. Adds integrity and preserves it for our military voters, for our students, for our seniors, every color, every which way, no matter who you are, every single eligible voter will be able to vote under this constitutional amendment. And members, with confidence, you can cast a green vote. And I ask you to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Washington, the Majority Leader, Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Kiffmeyer, for bringing the bill forward and through the process, and thank you, members, for a good debate. I think, members, that once again we've been offered an argument for and an argument against, and the argument against is again for something else. We've heard that we would have disenfranchisement. We've heard that we would have an end to same-day voting. We've heard that we would have a great change to absentee voting. We've heard of all of the arguments against, and it's really trying to complicate the issue. And the issue is a very, very simple issue. Are you who you say you are when you go to vote? It's a pretty simple issue. It's a pretty simple question. And my guess is, Representative Thiessen, that when you're out this fall and you're campaigning and you ask people that simple question, they'll probably agree with you that you should probably be who you say you are when you go to vote, because if you can't trust the integrity of the system itself is a problem. And if elections were not close, it probably wouldn't matter, but in the state of Minnesota, they always seem to be close, don't they? And it really does matter, because you have to trust the outcome of elections. You can't trust the outcome of elections if you don't have integrity in the system. You can't have integrity in the system if you don't have trust. My guess is, members, that whether you're on that side of the aisle or this side of the aisle, and you talk to the people when you go home this weekend for Easter Passover break, they will probably say, why aren't we doing this already, if they don't think that we already do. This is a common sense piece of legislation that half of the other states are already doing. Members, this is a vote for integrity. It's a vote for moving forward for one simple question. Are you who you say you are when you go to vote? It's what our voters expect from us. It's what they expect is already there. Thank you, Representative Kiffmeyer, for bringing this forward. Thank you for your very, very hard work, and for those on the conference committee and those on the committees that have worked so very, very hard. And thank you, members, for a green vote.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. We are under call. The clerk will close the roll. There being 72 ayes and 57 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by conference. Its title agreed to. The member from Washington, Representative Dean.
Speaker, I move the calendar that continued.
Representative Dean moves that the calendar of today be continued. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. Motions and resolutions. There are a copy of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there are no objections, we will take action on these motions first. Hearing no objections, the motions prevail. Announcements. Announcements. The member from Wright, Representative Anderson B.
Mr. Speaker, members, there will be no Bible study in the morning.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
The DFL members of the Ways and Means Committee, we were going to meet at 9 o'clock. We'll meet probably about 11, I think. We'll send out an email in the morning, but sleep in.
Announcements. The member from Washington, the Majority Leader, Representative Dean.
Mr. Speaker, I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 12 p.m. Wednesday, April 4th, 2012.
Representative Dean moves that the House adjourns today. It adjourns until 12 p.m. noon Wednesday, April 4th, 2012. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. Member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Dean, could you just clarify kind of what's going to happen when we come in at noon tomorrow? I understand we were going to break for about an hour and then come into session. Is that correct?
The member from Washington, Representative Dean.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Representative Thiessen will be coming in right away at noon and then be breaking very shortly thereafter for caucus for approximately 1 hour.
Member from Washington, Representative Dean.
I move the House do now adjourn.
Representative Dean moves the House do now adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. The House stands adjourned until 12 noon, April 4th, 2012.